Good afternoon, everybody. We're delighted to be here and to have an opportunity to share with you some of the key findings from our longitudinal study. And especially as we're in this context, it seems appropriate to mention teams. And I think everybody has mentioned this so far. So just very briefly to say that two members of our core team, Eileen Winter, Paul O'Raw from ICEP Europe, are unable to be here today, but just to thank them. And we had a whole array of people helping us in data collection and in support from Trinity College, including Miriam Toomey, Paula Flynn, Esther Murphy, Fiona Smith. We had Therese McPhillips from St. Pat's, and we had an array of people also from the University of Southampton. Northampton. God, that's a good start, isn't it? There you are. I've just done a transfer for you already, Richard. And we have a few of these in the audience, including Yu Zhao and Paul Bramble, and also Mary Dovston and Phil Ellender. So we're delighted to have worked with these people, and we learned an enormous amount working with them and everything that we did there. So just to go into look at, I'm going to sort of take you through just briefly the research aims, give you some idea of the data set that was involved, and then give you some of the initial findings around policy and provision. And Richard's going to take you through experience and outcomes, and we'll just explain how we came up with those headings as well. So you can see the research aims are ambitious, but we hope that we've managed to give some insights and hopefully some critical insights into what's happening within a range of schools involved in delivering special education provision. So we want to see how inclusive education policy is being implemented, what's actually happening on the ground. Look at the provision made by schools and how they understand this type of provision, and then look at the experiences of the pupils and their families in relation to the provision and the outcomes. And this is a very, very clear focus, as you'll see when you see the kind of work that we've been doing. So obviously the method's fairly straightforward, the review of Irish and international literature. We had an electronic survey of a representative sample of schools. However, we have to give a little caution here. There was a low return rate on this, so we have to treat some of these findings with care. We also had focus groups, and these were very much to try and establish what is the terrain, what is the ground, what are the key issues that we need to address, looking at this particular very, very complex issue. And then the core of our work really were case studies developed in 10 primary, 10 post-primary and 4 special schools. So that was what we did, and we did this over a 3-year period. So we followed up on this. Now again, you don't have to look at this and worry too much about it, but this is just to give you an idea of the range of people that were involved in the study. And what we tried to do was interview everybody around the child, gather as much documentation as was appropriate. We did observations as well, and to try and build up a strong pupil profile, build up a strong school profile, and also looking at parents, obviously, as a critical factor as well. So that just gives you some idea then the overall total data set. This is why you see we needed such a team involved. So it was 943 interviews, over 1,000 documents, 134 observations. We also took some pictures in the school of displays and the type of work and how schools valued work from their children. And then some videos, and also websites became increasingly important in putting forward some of the key aspects of provision within schools. This was how we devised our case studies, looking at policy, provision, experience and outcomes. And you can see there the different levels that we were working at, from classroom observation. Then we did interviews with the pupils, teachers, SNAs, principals, support staff, and this sometimes were people from outside the school as well. And we were trying to look at policy, look at resources, look at services, look at the curriculum and the type of teaching that was happening in the classroom, and then to look at pupil attainment and also very strongly social interactions, and this was under outcomes. So our key findings then are under these 4 headings: policy, provision, experience and outcomes. In terms of policy, what was very clear in also coming from the electronic survey, but more particularly from our case study schools, that most schools, the vast majority, did have a specific special needs policy. However, these were very variable, and there was very little indication of how the school itself was trying to move towards more inclusive provision. So this was fairly evident. We saw in school admission and enrolment policies that there was a strong recognition that schools wanted to make provision for diverse learners, and this just didn't include children with special education needs. It was much broader than that. However, one concern that certainly came through was that many of these policies had clauses limiting access for those with complex needs, in particular those children with special educational needs. In terms of provision then, and we just divided this up because this was a very, very long, detailed kind of section. There was evidence, strong evidence in primary schools that dedicated special education needs teams had emerged. But this was less in evidence in post-primary schools, and we think there's different reasons for this in terms of changes in resource allocation systems and how these resources were being used at primary and post-primary. The assessment process for resource allocation was problematic for a number of schools, for a number of parents, and in some cases parents were paying for private assessments. And this wasn't necessarily psychological, it could be for occupational therapy. So that this was pointing to a more critical issue that Richard will pick up on in looking at the implications of this. In terms of the models of support, it was very evident from the survey, but also from the schools, that the withdrawal model was most in evidence. There was some evidence of small group work, children being withdrawn into small groups. But again, this was the dominant model. There was very few examples of team teaching or co-teaching. Special needs assistants were seen as a valuable resource by schools and parents. However, it was very evident that as the children got older, the support from the SNAs really needed to evolve. So we had one situation where a child of 9 had an SNA, but he didn't know he had one. And the way that the whole program was developed and how the teacher worked with the SNA in ensuring that that child got support immediately that he needed it, but the SNA was also available to support other people, other children in the class, but under the direction of the teacher. And we began to see some children saying they didn't want the SNA necessarily to be beside them. They wanted them there to support them, but that it wasn't as evident in that way. So therapeutic provision, where available, was highly valued by schools and parents, though there were access problems in terms of getting these services. We saw in the special schools we're involved with, and again, some of these findings, we were only in 4 special schools, so we don't want to say that this is definitive, but they had a very positive relationships developed with therapeutic services. And in one school we were in, the services were providing training, occupational therapy training for teachers and parents actually in the school. And this was seen as very beneficial by everybody involved. In terms of behaviour support, this was a real live issue for many, many schools, but they particularly valued support from National Education Psychological Service, the National Behaviour Support Service where that was available, and the Special Education Support Service as well. And these were valued, highly valued and effective. And we saw a number of examples of children who had made a transition into secondary school, got into a bit of trouble, probably would have been suspended in certain other schools, and instead there was a behaviour support worker there supporting the child, put him on targets for 2 weeks, and he was back included again, and he'd begun to realise what was going wrong for him. And this was seen as very, very effective. The role of the Special Education Needs Organiser was appreciated by schools. Schools did appreciate the difficulties they faced in allocating scarce resources. We saw some very good examples of collaborative working relationships, and we saw one particularly noteworthy one of Sino working with parents, and this was very highly valued by parents in terms of planning and understanding what was available for them. In terms of the class, in terms of primary and the subject teachers at post-primary, there was at times a high level of uncertainty about how best to support the children with special education needs. There was very limited differentiation of the curriculum and evidence. It was obviously down maybe to one or two aspects of differentiation, and there wasn't really a very complete understanding of what this differentiation would look like. The teachers and the principals were able to identify very clearly that continuing professional development in these areas for all teachers was essential, not just for specialist teachers. Also, many pupils, and particularly at post-primary level, were exempted from Irish, but there had been very little discussion of future implications for careers for these children if they weren't doing Irish. And often the Irish class was used to provide support for the child. But again, this became very evident. In terms of the special schools, we saw a very strong emphasis on social aspects of the curriculum. And this was very, very effective and a lot of independent living skills for these children. However, for pupils with intellectual disability in mainstream schools, post-primary schools, we saw many of them survive very, very well up to junior cycle. In senior cycle, some of them, and I emphasize some of them, did have difficulties accessing appropriate accreditation. And so other programs such as ASDAN from the United Kingdom were being brought in to try and support these children. But it is definitely an issue. Many schools have developed individual education plans, and we saw many of them, but there was a huge variation in quality and implementation, particularly in pupil and parental involvement. There was very limited involvement of pupils and parents at that level, which is an area of concern. In special schools, IEPs tend to be very highly developed, and there was evidence that these had been developed over many years. There was a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge, and this was evident there. The continuing professional development provided by the SESS, Special Education Support Service, was highly valued where accessed by schools. However, there were some other schools that had never accessed support from SESS. There was very limited interaction then between special and mainstream schools. Even ones in very, very close vicinity, there was very, very little interaction. I'm going to hand over to Richard to take you through the rest. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to pick up on the experiences, and obviously we looked at our case study schools, our 24 schools, in a lot of detail. You know, we spent a lot of time in all of those schools. So what I'm going to be talking about is largely on the basis of the interviews, many interviews we conducted with parents and children, staff in those schools. And certainly it was true to say that the majority of the parents that we interviewed were satisfied with both the academic and social experiences of their children. It was noticeable that I think there were few exceptions to parents actually emphasising the importance of the social outcomes for their children. Many of the parents saw the social outcomes being at least as important to their children as the academic attainment that they were gaining within the school. Home-school interactions were generally seen as positive, particularly in the primary and I have to say the special schools. And regular communication between those schools, the schools and parents, was appreciated. But there was some evidence of parental dissatisfaction during the period of transfer to from mainstream primary to post-primary schools. This often centred around issues such as a loss of resources, loss of SNA support, for instance, or the fact that there had been specialist programmes put into place in the primary school where, of course, these were often managed by one teacher supported maybe by a resource teacher, but when they got to post-primary school, that level of support seemed not to be there anymore, and we did get quite a lot of dissatisfaction expressed by parents over that aspect of transfer. Having said that, the actual process of transition and information sharing from primary to post-primary was generally seen as very good. Pupils spoke very well of the support that they'd received during this period, and parents were generally very positive about the way that that system had been actually handled. Post-school placement was seen as problematic, however. Preparation for post-school life was seen as particularly difficult for children who had any kind of intellectual difficulty, and also for those with SEBD or those on the autism spectrum. And a lack of provision or a lack of preparation for post-school life was seen as a major issue. The pupils that we interviewed, and there were many of them, were generally very happy with school. They were often happy for social reasons, that they saw school as a very important social aspect of their life as much as a learning experience. But they became increasingly aware of their difficulties as they progressed through their school lives. And the maintenance of things like friendships and the distance between themselves and their peers became more apparent to them. And they were, in some instances, less satisfied because of that situation. Talking about outcomes is something which we spent a lot of time thinking about. It's quite a challenging notion, measuring outcomes for children with special educational needs, because there are processes in all of the schools for assessing attainment and the academic achievements of pupils, and we saw an awful lot of testing. I can tell you that we went to some schools where children were being subjected to batteries of 20 or 30 tests. But we came to the conclusion that many children were undergoing testing procedures which were completely unfit for purpose. And that the focus of those tests was really giving very little by the way of useful information. There was a great emphasis on summative assessment, and very little of that information was used in a formative manner. And so there were some real difficulties with assessment of these pupils. The assessment of social outcomes were less often managed within the schools. And whilst we saw pupils who were making academic progress in school, and it was being recorded, it was evident that by the end of the primary phase, pupils themselves and the parents were very aware that children were falling increasingly behind their peers. It is interesting, though, to look at social outcomes, and schools often have the ability to improve the sociability of children and to support them in social situations very effectively. And we did see that as children got older, they were much more socially confident. Certainly the young people we interviewed expressed their confidence about their own needs and abilities and their own achievements and performance. But there were notable exceptions. Children on the autism spectrum, often because of their difficulties with communication, for instance, were sometimes much more distanced from their peers and seemed to struggle to make any kind of social progress. And the same occurred with children with emotional behavioural difficulties, who seemed in some instances to become increasingly disaffected as they got older and progressed through the education system. But most pupils in our sample had achieved junior certificate, as it says here, mainly at ordinary level, by the time they progressed through school. We did have in our sample children who transferred from to special schools from mainstream schools, mainly at the end of the primary education years. And they seemed to settle very well. The special schools that we visited made very good provision for these young people and had good systems in place to support that transfer. And both the parents and the young people themselves seemed to be very satisfied with the progress that had been made. This we felt was quite significant because many of these parents had felt a great apprehension about this transfer and were particularly concerned about the way that their young people would react to that kind of situation. In common with other studies that we've heard today, we did look at the Douglas model of measuring attainment and the outcomes, rather, for pupils. And we looked at this separately for primary, post-primary and special school pupils within our samples. And what is very noticeable is over a period of time, and this I think was one of the big advantages of a longitudinal study, we were able to gather information from a series of interviews, from test results, from our observations of the children actually in a number of both formal learning and social situations. It was noticeable that pupils were making significant progress in the areas of attainment, engagement, happiness, and independence. If we look at the figures, we see that these children are generally making progress. That the third column, less than satisfactory progress, numbers are relatively small. And again, if we disaggregate these and we look at our sample population, which obviously we've done in the report, we can see that many of these children are those with emotional behavioural difficulties, those on the autism spectrum, for instance, who are having difficulties in these particular areas. I'm not going to dwell on the three charts here. You've got the figures for yourself, but just to say that was true in all the phases of education. So the implications of the research. What do we think we found that might be significant in terms of the development of provision here in Ireland? Well, at a systemic level, we do believe that a failure to fully implement the Epsom Act is causing difficulties for schools. It's causing a certain amount of confusion, for instance, over the requirement for IEPs. And we feel that the implementation of the Act, if it was fully implemented, would actually enable schools to have a greater understanding of how they're expected to move forward. There are definite difficulties with assessing progress and outcomes. We feel that one of the major issues for us as researchers was that schools actually, when they talk about progress and outcomes, still talk, generally speaking, in terms of attainment. There's a big difference, for instance, between an understanding of attainment and achievement. And we did see pupils who were making significant progress, in some cases compatible with that of their peers without special educational needs, but were still being recorded as under-attaining, whereas they were achieving very well. And there is a significant difference there. And we think actually schools need to develop a much more inclusive approach towards the assessment of children, which includes their social outcomes as well. And we think that this is a major undertaking that needs to be followed if progress is going to be made. At school level, as Michael mentioned, there are exclusionary clauses. We never found a single school enrollment document, for instance, which didn't say we are committed to inclusion. And we had a lot of expressions like this school welcomes everybody from our local community, and then clauses saying once they've had an assessment and they have the appropriate resources to meet their needs provided by NCSE. Which is not a very inclusive approach in our views. And that was a very common statement we found within many of the policies. We feel that there's a need to provide guidance to parents at particular transition points. Many parents were confused and in some cases angry at transition from primary to post-primary because they felt there was a loss of support. My child has had SNA support all the way through primary school. He's now going to post-primary and that is being taken away. In some cases we would say that SNA support was no longer needed. And as Michael said, the use of SNA support was very variable across the schools. But actually the communication of that resourcing change is an issue for many parents and was a source of some distress to some of them. As Michael mentioned, we did see an awful lot of use of withdrawal as the dominant method of supporting pupils. Children taking away from their peers into either individual teaching or small group teaching. And that seemed to be the approach that was favoured in many schools. without much consideration given of how the work from those withdrawn sessions is incorporated into the classroom when the child goes back. We saw very little example of team teaching, although where we did see it, it was a very good quality. And we did see examples of resource teachers working inside classrooms alongside teachers to provide scaffolding and support to those teachers, and it did work effectively, and the children did respond very well in those situations. But that was the exception rather than the rule. We saw some very good involvement of special needs assistants who were involved in decision-making, collaborative planning, and understanding fully the perspectives of the teachers with regards to the kind of support that was being provided. But this was not necessarily consistent. And we did see that this was far more consistent in primary schools than it was in the post-primary years. So at the levels of continuing professional development, we found that teachers are immensely committed to their own professional development. And we found that resource teachers and learning support teachers have undertaken really good quality training. And much of that training provided locally within their schools or in local courses or in HEI providers has been well received by those professionals. But actually it's the next level of the ordinary classroom teacher where this provision seems to be lacking. And many of those teachers express a need to become skilled themselves, and there is a certain amount of dependency upon the resource teachers as the experts within the school who are going to solve problems. Focused CPD for the development of IEPs has been provided in some cases, and it's had major benefits, and the NCSE guidelines have been helpful in this respect. But again, it's very inconsistent. And as Michael said, the differentiation that we saw tended to be very limited. There were very little range of approaches to differentiating within the classroom. And we feel that there's a definite need for much more professional development in this area. And we think one way of doing this is we have identified some exceptionally good schools that are doing these things very well. And maybe the demonstration site model, where these schools are held up for good practice and people can actually learn from what they're doing, would be an effective way forward. Support from external agencies. We did find very good relationships often between, for instance, HSE and schools. But it was very variable. It depends often where you live, which part of the country you're in, what kind of service you get, and how easy it is to access. We also found that, some of the excellent policies that are already in place here in Ireland need to actually be implemented. They are very strong in the message they give, but actually, at the moment, they remain as paper exercises, and things like, the working group report on assessment needs to actually be followed through. That's a very new one, obviously, but also the progressing disability services notion needs to be followed through if progress is to be made. So, some final thoughts. We have to say that we would suggest that there are major policy initiatives and investments in this country that have changed the face of special education, even in the period that we've been doing this study. And that there are significant increases, for instance, in teacher confidence in some areas, and improved opportunities for training, and improved understandings with regards to certain populations of children with special educational needs. But as we said, that is tempered by the fact that there are great initiatives out there. And again, I go back to the guidelines on IEPs, which we see as a very strong document. But unless they're supported to move things forward, things are going to remain quite static. There's certainly a greater commitment to inclusive practice. We saw very little negativity towards having children with special needs in classrooms. There were the usual concerns you'd expect around children with social, emotional and behavioural difficulties, but in general, teachers, parents, everybody within the school population was very much in favour of moving towards a more inclusive model. We did see, however, that there are current barriers to developing inclusive learning environments. They are around the things that we've said, around understanding of different pedagogical aspects of training. And, you know, we feel it's very important here in Ireland that we ask, as a society and as stakeholders, are we prepared to take the next step towards establishing inclusive learning environments as the norm? And we believe that actually the majority of teachers in Ireland certainly are prepared to do that if they're given the right support. Okay, thank you.